The Prime Minister was wrong in principle to condition the recognition of Palestine on the actions of the Netanyahu government, and wrong in practice as he has been ignored. So will the Foreign Secretary confirm today that the UK will recognise Palestine later this month at the UN? The government must learn a lesson and now apply relentless pressure to the Netanyahu government. So Liberal Democrats call today on the Foreign Secretary finally to sanction Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Unbearable suffering that we're seeing, biblical levels of injustice and pain and hunger. Does the Foreign Secretary recognise the parallel crisis in the belief of ordinary people across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in international law and in the UK's response? People who aren't seeing their values reflected in the UK's actions, in the continued supply of arms, in the failure to levy all possible sanctions and in the strings attached to the recognition of the State of Palestine.
The Foreign Secretary in his statement outlined all of the steps that this government has taken against the Netanyahu government. He has also repeatedly said that the UK has done everything it can. In my mind, both are tacit admittances of defeat, as we have seen the Netanyahu government increase its activity in Gaza, increase its prosecution and persecution of the Gazan people. My question to the Foreign Secretary is, if we have done so much and had no effect, if there is nothing left to do, what does he expect to change before the UN General Assembly meeting, and why should we not immediately recognise a Palestinian state?
Madam Deputy Speaker, another, I'm afraid, profoundly disappointing statement from the Foreign Secretary, devoid of anything that is likely to bring a swift end to this conflict. While at home the police have been arresting vicars and grannies and the government's been hiring American spy planes to fly over Gaza, as he himself said, the Israelis have intensified that campaign, their aggression and the slaughter of innocents in that awful conflict. And everything he said, all his condemnation has come to nothing. In every statement I've been in this chamber that he's spoken at, he's stressed the importance of international humanitarian law. So my question today is why he's been so passive in defending the International Criminal Court in the face of another wave of American sanctions. What steps is he going to take to support that institution and the individuals that staff it in the face of these sanctions? And what discussions has he had with the American government to get them to reverse them?
We must say, without a shred of equivocation, the shooting and starving of innocent civilians in Gaza is nothing other than utterly and totally, fundamentally evil. There can be no other word for it. So why has this government still failed to sanction Netanyahu and his entire cabinet?
Statement, Foreign Secretary.
Yeah. Well, with permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to make a statement on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories and Iran. In Gaza on the ground, it's unimaginably bleak. Horrifying images and accounts will be seared into the minds of colleagues across this House. They're almost impossible to put into words. But we can and must be precise with our language, because on the 22nd of August, the UN-backed IPC mechanism confirmed what we are witnessing. Famine. Famine in Gaza City, famine in its surrounding neighbourhoods, now spreading across the wider territory, famine which, unchecked, will spiral into widespread starvation. Madam Deputy Speaker, this was foreseen. The terrible conclusion of the obstacles we have warned about for over 6 months. Since the 1st of July, over 300 people have died from malnutrition, including 119 children. More than 132,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of dying from hunger by June of next year. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not a natural disaster, it's a man-made famine in the 21st century. And I'm outraged by the Israeli government's refusal to allow in sufficient aid. We need a massive massive humanitarian response to prevent more deaths, crucial NGOs, humanitarians and health workers allowed to operate, and stockpiles of aid on Gaza's borders released. As a result, in the past 3 months, over 2,000 Gazans have been killed trying to feed their families. And Hamas themselves are exploiting the chaos and deliberately starving Israeli hostages for abhorrent political purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that these words of condemnation echoed across legislatures all over the world are not enough. But be in no doubt, we have acted as a country where we can. We restored funding to UNRWA. We suspended arms exports that could be used in Gaza. We signed a landmark agreement with the Palestinian Authority. We stood up for the independence of international courts. We've delivered 3 sanctions packages, 3, on violent settlers and far-right Israeli ministers for incitement. We've suspended trade negotiations with the Israeli government, and we are at the forefront of the international community's work to plan for a stable post-conflict peace. And we've now provided over £250 million in development assistance over the past 2 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, today we're going further. I can announce an additional £15 million worth of aid and medical care for Gaza and the region. We continue to work alongside regional partners, including Egypt and Jordan, of course, to enable the UN and NGOs to ensure aid reaches those most in need. Brave medics in Gaza tell us that essential medicines are running out and they cannot operate safely. And that's why we're funding UK Med, whose field hospitals have treated over 600,000 Gazans. And that's why we're also funding the WHO Egypt to treat thousands of evacuated Gazan people. Meanwhile, Madam Deputy Speaker, as my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, said earlier, we are working with the World Health Organization to get critically ill and injured children into the UK, where they'll receive specialist NHS treatment. The first patients are expected to arrive in the UK in the coming weeks. And we're extracting people from a war zone, of course, that is complex and dangerous. It relies entirely on Israeli permissions, and I'm pressing the Israeli government for this to happen as quickly as possible. We're also supporting brilliant students granted FCDO achieving scholarships and other scholarships to escape Gaza so that they can take up their places for the coming academic year. Madam Deputy Speaker, I recognise that this only touches the edges of this catastrophe. We all know that there is only one way out: an immediate ceasefire. An immediate ceasefire that would see the unconditional release by Hamas of all hostages. An immediate ceasefire that would see a transformation in the delivery of aid. We know this. Our US and European allies know it. Our Gulf partners know it too. And I'm working night and day with them to deliver a ceasefire and a wider political process to deliver long-term peace. To make a ceasefire last, we need a monitoring mechanism, we need the disarmament of Hamas, we need a new governance framework for Gaza. This is the focus of our intense diplomacy in the region. In contrast, further military operations in Gaza City will only prolong and deepen this crisis. So together with our partners, we demand an immediate halt to this operation. Each week brings new horrors. Last week's double strike on Nasser Hospital, one of Gaza's last remaining major health facilities, killed 20 people, including 5 journalists. I remind Israel once again that international law requires the protection of healthcare workers, journalists and civilians. these actions will not end the war. They will not bring the hostages home, let alone make them safer, as hostage families have recognised. They will sow despair and anger across the region for generations. And Madam Deputy Speaker, in the West Bank, the Israeli government is tightening its stranglehold on the Palestinian economy and continues to approve illegal settlement construction. Just recently in the E1 area east of Jerusalem. This would erect a physical barrier to the contiguous Palestinian state, and it must not happen. Madam Deputy Speaker, in July, I described before the UN General Assembly our intention to recognise the state of Palestine later this month. Unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza and commits to a long-term sustainable peace. Madam Deputy Speaker, this commitment responds to the current crisis, but stems from our historic responsibility to the region's security, reaching back over a century to the Balfour Declaration. As I said last month in New York, I am deeply proud that it was a British Foreign Secretary who helped establish a homeland for the Jewish people. But the same declaration promised that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the Palestinian people. And Madam Deputy Speaker, those rights are more under threat than at any point in the past century. To those who say recognition rewards Hamas or threatens Israeli security, it does neither. Recognition is rooted in the principle of a two-state solution which Hamas rejects. We have been clear that any Palestinian state should be demilitarized. Indeed, President Abbas has confirmed this in writing. We see no contradiction between the two-state solution and our deep commitment to Israeli security, because security comes from stable borders, not indefinite occupation. Madam Deputy Speaker, before I finish, I would also like to update the House on Iran. On the 28th of August, the UK, along with France and Germany, triggered the snapback mechanism under the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. This means that if no agreement is reached within 30 days, the sanctions that were lifted under the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, will come back into force. These wide-ranging sanctions include a full arms embargo and restrictions on its nuclear, missile and drone programme. This was not a decision we took lightly. For years, we have worked with international partners to stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. The 2015 deal was meant to do just that, but Iran has repeatedly undermined the agreement. Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium is now 40 times over the limit that was set by the JCPOA. Despite this clear escalation, we have made every effort over years of negotiations to bring Iran back to compliance. These efforts have continued in recent months. I've urged Foreign Minister Araghchi to de-escalate and choose diplomacy. In July, we offered Iran more time if it agreed to return to negotiations with the United States and to restore full access to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Last month, I warned Iran that time was short and we would have little choice but to trigger snapback. I regret to inform the House that Iran has not complied with its legal obligations nor chosen the path of diplomacy, so we have had no choice but to act. I have long been clear that I will not allow snapback to expire without a durable and comprehensive deal. It would be unacceptable to allow this issue to fall off the UN Security Council agenda despite the threat posed by Iran's nuclear programme. But snapback is not the end of diplomacy, Madam Deputy Speaker, as Secretary Rubio has also recently underlined. Iran can still meet our conditions. It can restore full IAEA access. It can address our concerns about its stockpile and enrichment and return to negotiations. Alongside our partners, I will continue to urge Iran to choose this path. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the worst of times, this government will continue to take all the steps that we can to alleviate suffering, to help bring regional conflict to an end, to create the conditions for long-term peace and security. We will not rest until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. The hostages are returned. A flood of aid reaches those in desperate need, and despite the obstacles before us, we will work with partners to preserve the two-state solution. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who will have up to 6.5 minutes for her contribution.
Chief Speaker, I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement today, and I also express my sympathy for the people of Afghanistan who are suffering from last night's major earthquake. Madam Deputy Speaker, when it comes to the Middle East, since this House last met, this awful conflict continues to see lives lost with such intolerable suffering. Hamas continues to refuse the release of all remaining hostages, despite the best efforts of those trying to broker peace. The hostages are now approaching 700 days in captivity, and the whole House will have been sickened by the harrowing clip of emaciated hostage FVR David released by Hamas over the summer. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire, and we are all familiar with the reports that we have seen on a daily basis on our news channels. The inhumane suffering, the recent airstrikes, and the inability to provide food for civilians simply cannot go on. We all want an urgent and sustainable end to this conflict, the release of the hostages from terrorist captivity, and to see aid for the people of Gaza. There are key questions for the British government to answer. The British government is in a position to help influence these outcomes, but is it actually leveraging its ability to fully do so? The government's frequent statements have so far not moved the dial closer to a sustainable end to this conflict. And as the Foreign Secretary himself has said, we are not in any position whatsoever to see any alleviation of this horrendous situation. Diplomacy is about putting in the hard yards to find solutions and not just giving statements. So I do want to ask the government on 3 specific points today. Is the government taking any new specific action to tighten the screws on Hamas, to pile more pressure on them to release the hostages? Should we expect more measures to further degrade Hamas's ability to finance their campaign of terror? And why is the government not leading on international efforts to produce a credible plan to exactly do this, with an agreement from all the key regional partners and players with an interest in peace to see Hamas leave Gaza? Secondly, can the Foreign Secretary update the House on precisely where we stand, what Britain is contributing to the efforts by the UN and to our regional allies to broker the release of hostages and to an end of the conflict? Are we intimately involved, and are we sending in the UK expertise to help? Because we do have great expertise when it comes to brokering these types of negotiations. Third, while we note his announcement on the support for women and girls yesterday, the government has yet to make essential breakthroughs on aid. Ministers obviously need to work around the clock with everyone, all our partners, including with the Israelis and multinational institutions to unblock the situation by coming up with practical solutions, even new solutions, that all sides can focus on when it comes to getting medical and food aid into Gaza. That does have to provide a significant increase in food and medical supplies to reach civilians, while addressing Israeli concerns about aid diversions, because those concerns are constant. Is the UK working with the multilateral bodies to try and mediate the divisions and the breakdowns of trust that have emerged with the government of Israel? Is the Foreign Secretary considering schemes similar to those that we implemented previously by the Conservative government, such as floating piers, and working with the US and Cyprus to put in place off the coast of Gaza to get aid in? We need practical and pragmatic solutions when it comes to getting food and medical supplies into innocent civilians in Gaza. On Labour's decision to recognise a Palestinian state, the government announced this huge shift in British policy just days after the House went into recess. We all support a two-state solution that guarantees security for both Israelis and Palestinians. But the Foreign Secretary must also know that recognising a Palestinian state in September will not secure the lasting peace we all want to see. Recognition is only meaningful if it's part of a formal peace process, and it should not happen while the hostages are still being held in terrorist captivity and while Hamas's reign of terror continues. So can the Foreign Secretary explain, with his plan to go ahead with recognition while hostages are still being held and while Hamas, who have predictably welcomed and been emboldened by this move, while they continue to hold on to power in Gaza, how and what practical measures are we proposing to remove Hamas from Gaza? The Foreign Secretary must realise that recognition will not secure the release of the hostages, and nor will it get aid into Gaza immediately. And with that, we have to always consider what tools of leverage we have when it comes to future peace processes and negotiations that could actually help a two-state solution to be established for a peaceful situation in the Middle East. How will this unilateral action help to advance the best shot that we have of achieving a two-state solution, which is also the expansion of the Abraham Accords and Saudi normalisation, through which we could also calibrate our actions? Madam Deputy Speaker, on the Middle East more broadly, the appalling behaviour of the Iranian regime has gone on for too long, and they have brought the initiation of the snapback process upon themselves. The Iranian people deserve much better. Tehran must never obtain a nuclear weapon, and Conservatives remain clear that the recent US strikes were necessary. So can the Foreign Secretary confirm whether he believes Iran has the capability and the intention of recommending or recommencing its nuclear programme, and whether his assumption is that snapback, the process will be seen through to completion? And finally, can the Foreign Secretary confirm whether or not he welcomes Israel's actions regarding the Houthi leadership in Yemen, and update the House on how the UK will now use this moment to further degrade the Houthis' ability to carry out the recent attacks and strikes that we have seen?
Well, I'm grateful to the Shadow Foreign Secretary for the tone of her remarks, and I'm pleased that she agrees with me, and I suppose the sentiment of the entire House, on the dire, as she describes it, humanitarian situation in Gaza, on the inhumanity that she also described. And she will recognise that even before we came to power, the last government was calling for a ceasefire that we all want to see. She asks what the government is doing in relation to Hamas. And can I just say to her that in New York, with our Arab partners, with the French and others, we were doing just that, supporting the Prime Minister's framework for peace, working with colleagues to establish the circumstances of the day after. We've been crystal clear there can be no role for Hamas. We need the demilitarization of Gaza, and we are working with partners to try and set about the trusteeship, the new governance arrangement with Gaza. And of course, no government is doing more than we are. We signed an MOU with the Palestinian Authority. We're working with them on reform in a deliberate, day-to-day action, because there must be a role subsequently for the Palestinian Authority. And she asks what new solutions might be found on aid, and that's where I depart with the sentiment of what she's saying, because I'm not sure we need new solutions. It's the old ones. It's UNRWA. It's OCHA. It's the World Food Programme. They exist. They exist. Let us support them. That is why it was this party that restored funding to UNRWA when it was opposed by the opposition. That is not what feeds, I say to her gently, that's not what feeds women and girls. The mechanisms are there. They work all over the globe. It worked last time when we had a ceasefire. Suddenly the trucks went up to 607. We can do it once more. That is the position of the UK government. I spoke to Tom Fletcher at the UN this morning to get the latest. The moderately good news is that truck movements are up in August over where they were when I last updated the House as we came to recess in July. But he reminded me 60 or 70 trucks a day is nowhere near where it needs to be. And one of the reasons why I found the extra resources today is because we know also that the medical situation is dire, and the work that we can do with UK Med is so important and so valued, even up against that horrific situation. And let me be crystal clear. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. Our demands are unconditional and have not changed. The hostages must be released without delay, and there can be no role for Hamas. But equally, she will have seen the situation in the West Bank. She didn't comment in her remarks on the E1 development, running a coach and horses through 2 states. 2 states has been a united position of every single party in this chamber. That is why we set out the plans that we did towards recognition. Unless we get the breakthrough that we need on the ceasefire and a full process, we will move to recognition when the UN meets at UNGA in New York. I'm grateful for her support on Iran and the snapback. My assessment is that no country needs the percentages of enriched uranium that we see in Iran. We don't have them in our country. We don't have them at sites like Sellafield and other, Urenco. There's absolutely no need for them. We need a baseline, and that's why we need the inspectors back in. We need to know where that highly enriched uranium has now gone, and that's why we've been very clear with the Iranians on the need to trigger snapback, and that we will see those sanctions come back unless we can reach a diplomatic solution in the next 30 days.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I read with alarm yesterday's report in the Washington Post detailing a plan that's circulating amongst the Trump administration about the future of Gaza. They call it the Great Plan. It proposes the total transformation of Gaza into a tourist region, a high-tech hub under temporary US administration. What's going to happen to the Gazans? Well, 2 million of them are going to be temporarily relocated to other countries, including Somaliland and South Sudan. Forced population transfer is contrary to and a complete violation of international humanitarian law. Madam Deputy Speaker, there must be serious thought given to the day after for Gaza, and my committee recommended as much in our report that was published in July. But this unserious, illegal and deeply dystopian plan cannot be the sum of that thinking. So what is the government doing to dissuade Donald Trump from following this path? And what, alongside regional and European allies, are we doing to put forward a serious plan for a peaceful future in Israel, Gaza and the West Bank, ready for the day after that this terrible war finally comes to an end?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable lady and dear friend for her remarks, and I would want to commend the work of her Select Committee on the day after and the thoroughness of approach that's required. I have read the reports, but it's sort of speculative stuff that I've seen in different news articles. It's not a comprehensive approach. And in my discussions with the US system, nothing that along the lines of what she said have I seen confirmed. The day after requires the removal of Hamas. It cannot be about the displacement, further displacement of the Gazan people. It is going to require a degree of finance and stability, particularly, which I think will require other states and particularly Arab partners. They would set themselves against the sorts of reports I've seen in the papers.
And I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson who has up to 3 minutes for his remarks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. I welcome the robust approach of the E3 in initiating the snapback mechanism in response to Iran's nuclear ambitions and programme in breach of its undertakings. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary's statement on the 21st of July shocked this House, and we had a long debate about the situation in Gaza. Yet the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and the West Bank has deteriorated even further since then, as he has acknowledged. We've seen hundreds more Palestinians killed while seeking aid, famine declared in the Strip, a chronic lack of medical supplies attested to by UK medics volunteering in Nasser Hospital, the start of IDF operations in Gaza City, and the images of emaciated hostages still held in brutal captivity by Hamas terrorists. The human suffering is indeed beyond comprehension. Yet the extremists are indifferent. Hamas terrorists publish videos intended to torment the families of hostages. Cabinet members Ben Gvir and Smotrich advocate for the forced displacement of Palestinians. In Israel, the Hostage Families Forum and the opposition parties call for an end to the violence. In the UK, our constituents are desperate for the same. The bloodshed can only be stopped by decisive actions, actions which I regret the government has so far failed to take. The Prime Minister was wrong in principle to condition the recognition of Palestine on the actions of the Netanyahu government, and wrong in practice as he has been ignored. So will the Foreign Secretary confirm today that the UK will recognise Palestine later this month at the UN? The government must learn a lesson and now apply relentless pressure to the Netanyahu government. So Liberal Democrats call today on the Foreign Secretary finally to sanction Prime Minister Netanyahu for expanding his military campaign and pursuing the illegal expansion of the E1 settlements, and to take the steps necessary to ban the export of all UK arms to Israel, including F-35 components. Will he also make representations to the Qatari government, demanding that they exile Hamas from their political headquarters unless they agree to the release of all of the hostages immediately and unconditionally? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary bemoans that words are not enough to alleviate the suffering. He acknowledges that the government has failed to move the combatants. Yet there is one man who could unlock progress. Donald Trump has the power to secure peace in Gaza if he chose to, by picking up the phone to Netanyahu. So will the Foreign Secretary tell the House how he will use his special relationship with Vice President Vance to help secure that goal? And will the government commit to making a ceasefire in Gaza a priority during President Trump's state visit?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his remarks on Iran particularly, and he's absolutely right to place at the centre the 15,000 people who have been injured in Gaza simply seeking aid, and the over 2,000 that have died seeking aid. It's totally unacceptable. And he's right too to remind the House about the position of the hostage families, who are crystal clear that they do not want to see further military endeavour and operation in Gaza City. What they want is a ceasefire, and they fear that further military endeavour will actually harm their loved ones further, not succeed in bringing them home. He criticises our position on recognition. I'd ask him to reflect on that, because it must be right that the government continues to give diplomacy and opportunity as we head to the UN alongside other partners. And surely he would want us to be working with our French, our Australian, our Canadian partners as we head to that gathering in UNGA. And surely he would want to see the Israelis commit to a ceasefire, commit to a process, end the war inevitably. All of that is what we are seeking to do as we make that assessment in the coming weeks of where we've got to. And of course, I would want to reassure him that of course I raise the issue of Gaza with all levels of the US administration, but I did raise the situation in Gaza with Vice President Vance earlier in the summer, with Secretary of State Rubio, and I spoke to Envoy Steve Witkoff in the last 24 hours to get an update on a fast-moving situation, of course. And direct sales of F-35s are banned to Israel, and he knows that we ban arms that could go to the IDF for use in Gaza.
Sir Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement today on Palestinian statehood and the additional aid that has been announced for Gaza, as well as the recent work that has taken place to evacuate students and children in need of medical treatment. But today, Madam Deputy Speaker, the world's foremost group of genocide scholars have said that Israel's policies and actions in Gaza meet the legal definition of genocide in Article 2 of the UN Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This is against the backdrop of Israel continuing to bombard Gaza, continuing to target and kill journalists, and continuing its policy of annexing the entire territory with Trumpian visions of Gaza, where the self-determination of Palestinians is little more than a real estate opportunity. Will the Foreign Secretary agree with me that this monumental resolution by genocide scholars should now trigger our responsibility to act?
Secretary.
Well, I'd say to my honourable friend that we continue to act to do all we can to bring this horrific suffering in this war to an end. Of course, I recognise what legal scholars are saying about the conflict and saying in relation to the issue of genocide. That must be appropriately a matter for the legal system. But I think the whole world looks on what is happening with deep concern, and in every legislature across the world, condemnation.
Rishi Sunak.
Thank you. I know the whole House will want to join me in wishing you a very happy birthday, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome and support what the Foreign Secretary said about Iran, and particularly the joint E3 statement on imposing snapback sanctions. Tehran is not just a threat to regional security, but also here at home. He will know our security services have foiled over 20 different Iranian-backed plots. But he will have also seen today that Russia and China have joined in a letter saying that they will work with Tehran in the UN to thwart snapback sanctions. So could he potentially update the House on the work that we will do with our allies on enforcement, and crucially make clear to companies and banks that there will be severe consequences for those that break the sanctions?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to former Prime Minister for his work on the Iran file and for the cross-party consensus that exists in this House in this area. As he knows, we work hand in glove, particularly with our French and German counterparts, and it was on that basis, the so-called E3, that we urged Iran to take us seriously in getting back to the negotiation table with the US, and also to let the inspectors back in. They still have an opportunity over the next 30 days, and we, of course, will do everything we can within the UN system to urge our Russian and Chinese friends to take seriously the solemn commitments that we made in the 20th century and continue to make in this one, that we must stop nuclear proliferation. This is not a personal issue, it's a global issue of huge concern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The International Association of Genocide Scholars has passed the resolution stating that Israel's policies and actions in Gaza meet the legal definition of genocide. I understand the Foreign Secretary doesn't comment on these matters from the dispatch box, so I'd like to ask instead what action and efforts this government are taking alongside international partners to ensure that evidence is being collected and matters are in hand to ensure that legal avenues can be pursued to address allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity and allegations of genocide in Gaza.
Foreign Secretary.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend and for recognising that that must rightly be a matter for lawyers. But can I reassure her that we do fund and support organisations on the ground gathering evidence. Now that is much easier in the West Bank than it is currently in Gaza, and at this dispatch box I've said time and time again I do think it's important that the Israelis let international journalists in to monitor. I think that's hugely important, but we will continue to support journalists, organisations, federations, where we can to monitor and support that work. And of course we support a lot of NGOs on the ground.
John Whittingdale.
Further to the answer the Foreign Secretary has just given, does he share my horror that among the thousands of civilian deaths that have occurred in Gaza, it's estimated that at least 200 journalists have been killed, some of them deliberately targeted? Does he agree that those of us who are supporters of Israel's right to defend itself need to tell the Israeli government that this is unacceptable and cannot continue?
I entirely would want to associate myself with the remarks that the right honourable gentleman has just made. It's not only unacceptable, it is diminishing in the eyes of young people across the globe who look at this with horror. They can't understand it. And so I urge the Israeli government to just step back and recognise the damage that they are doing to their reputations collectively.
James Naish.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Attempts to settle the E1 area of the West Bank, splitting Palestinian areas in two, in an Israeli government minister's own words, will bury the idea of a Palestinian state by the end of this month. Would the Secretary of State commit to a further coordinated response with European partners over the coming weeks to ensure that those destructive plans are halted?
Secretary.
Yes, yes, yes. You know, I've spent time in Bedouin villages that would be entirely gone as a result of these abysmal plans. So, of course, I will continue to work with partners to oppose them.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In May, the government revealed in court that it, the executive, had made recent assessments of the risk of breaches of international humanitarian law in Gaza. I say breaches, but the government revealed that it had found only one possible breach of IHL among tens of thousands of airstrikes in Gaza across 11 months. Surely this proves that the FCDO does not have the capacity to properly assess all the possible breaches of IHL in Gaza.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, it's axiomatic that the honourable gentleman is wrong. I made an assessment back in September that there was a clear risk. That was based on IHL assessments, and for that reason we suspended arms sales to Gaza. The machinery of government's working very well in terms of the assessments it's able to make, notwithstanding, of course, how difficult it is to get all the evidence that's necessary.
Louise Sandert-Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The famine in Gaza is clearly man-made and is abominable. The tens of thousands of civilians that have been brutally killed is abominable. The retention of the hostages by Hamas and even the retention of those who have passed away in their bodies is equally abominable. We can all see what is happening in Gaza and we can all see what is happening in the West Bank, and this cannot be allowed to continue. What more messages can we send to Netanyahu and the Israeli government to say that the two-state solution is the only way forward, It is the only way to guarantee the peace and security in the Middle East that every single innocent civilian deserves, and to stop the increased illegal settlements in the West Bank.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'd want to associate myself with the remarks of the Honourable Lady and congratulate her, I think, on her recent wedding. She's absolutely right, because there seem to be those in the Israeli government that either want to see one state in which it's incumbent on them to be clear about how everyone in that one state has equality before the law, or they want to see no state perpetuated forever. And that we must stand against, because it's not in the interests of Israel to be safe and secure, and it's fundamentally against the interests of the Palestinian people, because the desire for two states is a just cause and one we must stand behind.
What action will His Majesty's government take if the government of Israel proceed with their plan to build in the E1 corridor?
Foreign Secretary.
I'm not going to get ahead of my skis. We continue to work with partners internationally on making those assessments. I spoke to the Israeli Foreign Minister and was very clear that we stand against this, and he will recall that the last government, when these plans surfaced, stood against the E1 development, and at that time I think the government's position was that they would recognise if they went ahead. So we will continue to make that assessment, but I hope we can see these plans put to one side.
Claire Hanna.
Last month, along with 8 party leaders across Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, I wrote to the Prime Minister about the catastrophic situation in Gaza and about the deficits in the UK response, alongside the unbearable suffering that we're seeing, biblical levels of injustice and pain and hunger. Does the Foreign Secretary recognise the parallel crisis in the belief of ordinary people across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in international law and in the UK's response? People who aren't seeing their values reflected in the UK's actions, in the continued supply of arms, in the failure to levy all possible sanctions, and in the strings attached to the recognition of the State of Palestine.
Foreign Secretary.
Can I just be clear? There is a lot of mendacity in relation to some of the sort of TikTok stuff that you see. We have stopped the sale of arms to Gaza. We have stopped the direct sales of F-35s to Gaza. To Israel. Germany only just recently made a decision that we made last September. 1% of sales is what the UK represents. 90% are Germany and the US system. And there are many other governments that supply stuff that have not made the decisions that we have made. And on recognition, we will continue to work with partners as we head towards UNGA and make those necessary assessments.
Edward Morello.
The Foreign Secretary in his statement outlined all of the steps that this government has taken against the Netanyahu government. He has also repeatedly said that the UK has done everything it can. In my mind, both are tacit admittances of defeat, as we have seen the Netanyahu government increase its activity in Gaza, increase its prosecution and persecution of the Gazan people. My question to the Foreign Secretary is, if we have done so much and had no effect, if there is nothing left to do, what does he expect to change before the UN General Assembly meeting, and why should we not immediately recognise a Palestinian state?
Foreign Secretary.
Diplomacy is failing until it succeeds. So I'm not going to give in to the Honourable Gentleman's pessimism. And can I just say that in my conversations with Prime Minister Mustafa, after I had completed my statement at the UN, he walked up to me and gave me a warm embrace. We continue to work alongside the Palestinian Authority as we make these fine judgments.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the government's decision to trigger the snapback mechanism to address the Iranian regime's nuclear ambitions. Following arrests in May relating to a suspected Iranian-backed terror plot, my constituents in High Peak, and indeed three-quarters of Labour voters, want to see action on the terror threat posed by Tehran on the streets in the UK. Can the Foreign Secretary provide an update on the government's progress in prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist group?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to Honourable Friend for raising this question, and he will know that alongside the Home Secretary, we commission work from Sir John Hall on that specific issue of state threats, and we will be coming forward with further plans in the coming months.
Stephen Flynn.
The Foreign Secretary has just said that on the ground it is unimaginably bleak. Horrifying images and accounts will be seared into the minds of colleagues across this House. They are almost impossible to put into words, but we can and we must be precise with our language. I agree. It's a genocide, isn't it?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the honourable gentleman joins many. I don't know if he's legally qualified, but I know that there are many lawyers that take that view. As he knows, we made an assessment based on a clear risk of a breach of international humanitarian law that meant that we did suspend arms sales that could be used in Gaza.
Tansing Desi.
Thank you very much, and happy birthday. Madam Deputy Speaker, Benjamin Netanyahu's blockade and weaponisation of starvation has plunged Gaza into famine. And that is why the UN Secretary-General has described this man-made catastrophe as a failure of humanity. And while children die of hunger, unfortunately, we have a situation whereby the Israeli government continues to deny the existence of starvation in the very territory that it seeks to occupy. Now, before the summer recess, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, informed the House about additional aid for Gaza. Can he inform us just how much of that aid has actually got into Gaza and what other further urgent steps is the government taking to bring this inhumane treatment of the population of the Palestinians to an end?
Well, can I reassure my honourable friend that the good news is that the aid that we have supported is getting in. Now, principally that has been around medical supplies, and there are medical supplies that are replacing the dire situation that exists in Gaza. But it's also the case that we've been able to work with the World Food Programme, and the World Food Programme appear to be the UN agency that is having most effect at delivering aid on the ground. They're not sufficient, but it is having some effect. I will be in the region in the coming days discussing these issues in further detail.
Kit Malthouse.
Madam Deputy Speaker, another, I'm afraid, profoundly disappointing statement from the Foreign Secretary, devoid of anything that is likely to bring a swift end to this conflict. While at home the police have been arresting vicars and grannies, and the government's been hiring American spy planes to fly over Gaza, as he himself said, the Israelis have intensified that campaign, their aggression and the slaughter of innocents in that awful conflict. And everything he said, all his condemnation has come to nothing. In every statement I've been in this chamber that he's spoken at, he's stressed the importance of international humanitarian law. So my question today is why he's been so passive in defending the International Criminal Court in the face of another wave of American sanctions. What steps is he going to take to support that institution and the individuals that staff it in the face of these sanctions? And what discussions has he had with the American government to get them to reverse them?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, it's just wrong to say that this government has been passive in relation to the ICC. We fund the ICC. We continue to support the ICC. I think I raised the ICC in my second meeting with Secretary of State Rubio. We work very closely with our Dutch colleagues, particularly on the ICC. We've been crystal clear on the importance of international humanitarian law. I'm afraid he's wrong on that issue.
Melanie Ward.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary will be aware that increasing numbers of human rights experts and genocide scholars assess that Israel's actions in Gaza equate to a genocide, with famine deliberately created and hospitals bombed to kill journalists. Against this backdrop, the government is right to recognise the state of Palestine and to do so in a way which tries to drive change on the ground. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary, does he share my deep concern at the unacceptable new restrictions on visas and registration set to shut down the work of the most effective international humanitarian organisations in Gaza, and what action is the government taking to try to prevent this?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is right. It is unacceptable restricting the ability of aid workers to go about their work in the face of such suffering. Can I put alongside her another issue that I'm hugely concerned about, which is effectively starving the Palestinian Authority of the funds also to pay its staff and complete the reforms that we're trying to work with it on, such that it can never get to a position where it can apply the governance that I know that it wishes and hopes to.
Sir Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I despair at many aspects of the conduct of the Netanyahu government and the suffering of Gazan civilians. However, I do have grave reservations about the timing of this unilateral recognition of the State of Palestine, because I fear it will allow Hamas to claim that the vile massacres of the 7th of October have somehow succeeded. This is a concern shared by many of my constituents. What reassurance can the Foreign Secretary give about the choice of timing and the signal that that sends?
Secretary.
Well, can I be crystal clear to the right honourable gentleman? Hamas is a terrorist prescribed organisation. There can be no future for them in Israel. When we do the work that I outlined on a framework for peace and on the day after in the region, part of that is how we disarm in Gaza, and part of that is how I suspect those to the left of Hamas exit Gaza, its leadership, and find a third place to be. So there can be no role for Hamas. But given what has been said about the E1 developments, let us also remember what is happening on the West Bank, the settler violence, those who seem totally opposed to two states. And what we sought to do is try and effect change on the ground as we make that assessment. And can I disagree with them? It's not unilateral. Canada, Australia, the French, we are acting together combined to try and bring about maximum leverage to bring about change on the ground.
Paul Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the government's intention to declare a state of Palestine formally at the UN later this month, something many of us on the Labour benches have been pushing for ever since we were elected, and something that was in our manifesto. It's the biggest shift in British foreign policy in decades, and is a major step forward to giving the Palestinian people the hope that they will have the state that they've long been denied. But while I welcome the sanctions on Iran today, with the famine now formally declared in Gaza, and with 132,000 children expected to suffer from an acute malnutrition between now and next June, can you tell me if the UK is actively looking at fresh sanctions on Israel to prevent that further tragedy?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I can't comment on sanctions from the dispatch box, but can I know that my honourable friend has campaigned long in his constituency and before on the issue of recognition, and so I'm grateful for his statements in relation to that, and I recognise that the situation I outlined, the situation that I was updated from by Tom Fletcher this morning, is grim, it's dire, it's horrendous, and that's why we have to work collectively with other partners. I'll be back in the region to see what more we can do.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This should not really be difficult. We can, as I do, passionately support Israel's right to exist securely and in peace. We must call for the immediate release of the hostages without any strings attached, demand the exclusion of Hamas from the post-conflict settlement, and at the same time, we must say, without a shred of equivocation, the shooting and starving of innocent civilians in Gaza is nothing other than utterly and totally, fundamentally evil. There can be no other word for it. So why has this government still failed to sanction Netanyahu and his entire cabinet?
Secretary.
Well, I hear the strength of passion from the right honourable gentleman, but let me say to him that I would urge him to look closely at our sanctions policy, and he will struggle to find any other government in the developed Western world. We've had 3 packages of sanctions just in the last year, and 2 on government. France, I don't think, have yet sanctioned government ministers, so we have done a considerable amount.